All right, well, welcome everybody, and thank you all for coming. I'm delighted to introduce our final speaker for the semester and for the academic year, Daniel Barber. Daniel is an old friend of mine, and I'll describe why in a moment. Why? No, not why, but how we know each other. Why is going to be obvious to anybody with eyes, but Daniel Barber is the head of school for the School of Architecture at the University of Technology in Sydney, and we're Sydney, Australia. We're really fortunate to have him here. He was most recently professor at the Weitzman School at the University of Pennsylvania, and before that has held a number of academic positions, including a MacArthur Fellowship.
Guggenheim.
A Guggenheim Fellowship.
Nice. A little more money that one.
Yeah. Oh, the MacArthur is coming, but he's held a Guggenheim Fellowship, a fellowship at the University of Heidelberg, fellowship at the University of Lisbon, Harvard University, has been, and has also been a visiting professor at Princeton. He's also the author of a number of texts over the last 10 years or so that have addressed the climate crisis in really powerful ways, especially dealing with the relationship between modern architecture and the technologies of thermal comfort and environmental comfort that we think of as completely inseparable from the rise of modernism, but are now also inseparable from any consideration of the climate crisis. He also wrote an absolutely elegant book in 2016, I think, A House in the Sun, which deals with early investigations of passive and active solar technologies in architecture. It is an elegant volume. I recommend it to you highly. And then more recently, I think in 2020, published book Modern Architecture and
Climate Design Before Air Conditioning.
Design Before Air Conditioning. Modern Architecture and Climate Design Before Air Conditioning, which then lays out a number of the arguments that he then follows up with the recent essay After Comfort, which hopefully will leave us uncomfortable enough to ask more critical questions about the way that we design, operate, and inhabit buildings. Also, because the last time I introduced a speaker, I totally left out the whole educational credentials, but I will say that Professor Barber holds a number of degrees, including a BA from University of Washington, UW in Seattle, home of for my eyes, the second prettiest collection of cherry trees in North America. Also, master's from Mills College, a master's in environmental design from Yale, and most importantly, a PhD in architectural history and theory from Columbia University in the city of New York, founded in the 1730s. Anyway, a fine institution at which to study architectural history and theory.
They all know. They all know that you are also an alum.
Well, they do now, yeah. Go Lions. Anyway, it's my pleasure to welcome my friend, Daniel Barber.
Thank you so much. Thank you, David, for that generous introduction. It's great to be back in Florida, and it's great to be welcomed in such a way. I had a great discussion with students this morning and look forward to continuing that today. I'm going to stay here kind of seated, right, and sort of pretend we're in kind of a seminar room, which is to say I'm going to ask a few questions along the way. I want to get some sort of feedback and hear what you have to say. As I go through trying to kind of untangle what I see as a really sort of complicated issue and an essential issue of our moment, right? Which is an effect that our buildings are reliant upon fossil fuel air conditioning. I mean, every building I've been in since I got, ever basically, but certainly in the past few days since I've arrived here, and we're probably hearing the projector in this case, but we can see at least the evidence. The registers, the kind of evidence of the importance of cycling air and the kind of air that we breathe that in effect comes from outside in a sense, but also is filtered through in effect sort of engaged with carbon on its way, right? So what I'm going to try to untangle a little bit or sort of tease out in a few different ways is how we have in the past imagined living without fossil-fueled HVAC systems, heating, ventilation, air conditioning systems, right? And then how we might kind of imagine living without them again in the future, right? And to really kind of note that where we are, right, is this kind of intense transitional moment, right? And hopefully you'll get the kind of shivers that I kind of get when I say that by the time I'm done. So I'm a historian, as noted, and it might be a little odd to, in that sense, kind of given the title of the talk, right, that's really about sort of speculation, right? It's about sort of after we have the capacity to experience this fossil-fueled comfort. So I say that to suggest that, we're going to be looking at the past, but also that we're going to kind of not quite get to the after part, right? We'll kind of see that off in the distance and keep kind of running towards it, but might not quite arrive. The premise that I'm trying to work out, and I actually gave this talk a few titles, so I'm just going to indulge myself by using them all. The premise that I've been sort of trying to work out with this material is how do we, by which I mean architects, the kind of design fields more broadly, architectural scientists, urban planners, product designers, et cetera, sort of the design professionals of the world, how do we support making everyone comfortable with being less comfortable? Right? How do we sort of imagine a world, and quite literally speculate on a set of designs in the world that they will shepherd in, that allows those of us, and I'll spend a lot of time talking about this kind of us and we thing in a minute, but those of us who have benefited for the past few decades from a profligate use of fossil fuels to condition and allow us to inhabit our spaces, how can we be more uncomfortable? Right? How can we allow ourselves to kind of a wider range of sort of comfort expectations? How does that shift the way that we think about ourselves and our lives and our families and our friends, right? But how does it also kind of shift the way we think about the future, right? And sort of give us a different sort of perspective on what might be coming next, right? And the kind of after. So how do we make ourselves uncomfortable? And we'll get into sort of get into the details, right? But also just to recognize that it's kind of a ridiculous thing to say. Right? I mean, it's a tough sell to say, why don't you be less comfortable, right? And especially, why don't you be less comfortable, you individuals here, and I could be saying this in many different rooms around the world, so that others can potentially be more comfortable, right? I mean, how do we begin to sort of make these equations? And some of those others might be in different regions. They might be down the street in a more heat-affected area of the city. They might be in the future, right? So we kind of want to see how we can take all of these people into account as we think about our own comfort. So that kind of gets to the third title as well, which is the premise that what we need to do as a field, right, is quite different, let's say tomorrow, than what it was yesterday, right? So today is our moment of transition. April 1st, right? It's a good moment to kind of start something new. How do we stop, basically, and I'm happy to field questions about this, right? How do we stop thinking about architects as designers of the built environment in the sense of buildings that emerge from the ground, right? And how do we start thinking about ourselves as agents of decarbonization, which is to say engaging with the existing built fabric and finding means to remove the carbon from it, which in all of its complexity, right? So that's a kind of leitmotif that will carry itself out throughout the talk as we play this through. Now, I do have one question just to kind of orient myself. One of these will become clear later. How many people have seen Oppenheimer? A few? What about Ted Lasso? Any Ted Lasso fans? I have sort of few. Okay, so some of you will get some of the jokes. Okay, what about Barbie? Everybody seen Barbie? See, that's great. Everybody has always seen Barbie. I don't have anything to say about Barbie, but it's just great because everybody's always seen Barbie. Can somebody tell me, and maybe not somebody that was in the class this morning, but if we get desperate, the difference between embodied carbon and operational carbon? Is that on your radar at all? Well, you're moving your fingers. Is that brain activity? No? Okay. Anybody? Maybe one of, I open it to the.
Embodied carbon kind of like all of the energy that goes into like the construction process, so like moving materials in and even the construction process itself, and then what was it?
Operational
Carbon, so like all of the carbon we used once we're like occupied.
Right, okay, good. Yeah, so basically in a sense, all of the energy and carbon involved in putting the building up, right? All the materials and construction processes and trucks idling in the street and holes that were dug, et cetera, kind of all of the energy required to produce the building is its embodied energy, right? It's now that energy, that carbon is kind of stuck in that building, so to speak, embodied in the building, right? It's digested it. Operational carbon being an energy being everything that happens after that, right? So when you open the door and the lights turn on and the exit signs go on and you walk up the escalator, that's all operational energy, as is HVAC, right? As is the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems that allow us to breathe again in these spaces. So I bring up that contrast just briefly in what seems like perhaps a kind of self-defeating way, but I'm mostly embodied energy is the bulk of the carbon emitted through the building industry today. And we can have a discussion. I'd be happy to kind of get into details after the lecture about how we can kind of imagine shifts. We'll play that out a little bit, kind of shifts in the embodied content. I'm mostly going to talk about operational energy, right? And so some of this is about, one of the kind of themes here is that in principle, one could decarbonize the electricity grid so that we could run the lights and the escalators and the air conditioning machines off decarbonized energy. I mean, soon maybe, right? So one of the arguments here is that we really should save in the embodied energy because we can save in the operational energy later. Does everybody get that? Yeah? So that's kind of where we should focus our time, right? So I'm saying that, but I'm also not doing that. I'm focusing my time elsewhere, in part because I don't really think the grid will be decarbonized, but I just want to sort of bring that whole discussion out into the open just as a way to kind of get us kind of in the zone of thinking about energy systems and buildings and how they operate, right? What we're seeing here is the a sort of typical heating and cooling system, let's say. This one happens to be at the Millie Institute in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. We all know that these kind of machines are hidden behind the walls or in the basements or on the rooftops, right? We all know that these sort of internal systems are there to allow us to breathe and to allow us to feel comfortable in this space. Is everybody feeling relatively comfortable? Yeah? Okay. I'm wearing the universal suit, so I'm a little hot. But if people want to kind of make themselves uncomfortable for a second, lean and so there you go. Just kind of see how, there you go, that's a good one. Just kind of see how long you can hold it until you're like, this is uncomfortable. We're just going to leave you there. So comfort has been a part of what architects provide, right? It's been a part of the service that architects bring to the world, right? And I just want to refer for a minute here to this quote from Richard Neutra from 1947, in which he writes, "There has, of course, always been comfort in the world," right? So kind of thinking in a long historical span. The kings were comfortable, the peasants were not, sort of thing, right? To put it in very schematic terms. There has always been comfort in the world, reckless comfort, we could say. Comfort based on someone else's continuous labor, right? So there's immediately, you can stop now if you want. Sorry, I was trying to feel bad for the guy. There's immediately an equity piece here, right? There's immediately a piece of, it's not quite a zero-sum game, right? But that we are comfortable by virtue of the fuel running through the system that we're effectively inhabiting. That has costs, right? And those costs tend to be paid by someone else. And we'll get into that in a little bit in a second. But this question of comfort being based on someone else's continuous labors, right? Now, another sage of the post-war era, Ted Lasso, says something quite similar. If I can make this work. Oh, he's not saying it, but that's OK. I finally accepted, he says, that air conditioning is a privilege and not a right. And if you watch this TV show, this was like the last kind of 2 minutes of the show, right? So this was the most important thing he said the whole time. Right? It all led up to this notion that air conditioning is a privilege and not a right, in the sense that this was the American going, if you haven't watched the show, sorry, but this is the American going to the UK, coming back with what are my lessons learned, right? That air conditioning is really a privilege, right? That some people get it and some people don't, right? And so we want to kind of recognize that immediately there's a kind of issue of equity that's built in. Okay, enough of Ted Lasso. Let's jump back to Neutra. Richard Neutra, you may know, an architect often quite heavily engaged in Los Angeles, right? A sort of Austrian emigre architect in the United States during the wartime and post-war period. Very much a kind of icon of a certain type of residential modernism. We're not going to get into them in great detail, but just to give you a few coordinates. This is, well, maybe come back to this slide. This is probably where I should have gone first, right? So this is Neutra's Kaufman House in Palm Springs, one of the better known. Again, thinking about sort of comfort and equity, right? And this kind of delicacy that he's playing out here of these indoor and outdoor spaces. Here's some schools that Neutra designed, what he referred to as open-air schools, right? Where this entire wall would sort of go up like an old garage door, right? And the students could sit outside, kind of expanding the spatial dimensions, of course, of the classroom while also adding adding a significant climatic element, right? Cooling the space off, assuming the day was more or less manageable. Neutra, I'm just sort of playing out this kind of narrative for a second to think about these questions of control and equity, sort of climate control and equity. Neutra was hired by the American government, at that time the Protectorate of Puerto Rico in the mid-1940s, to design some buildings for these for this site, some schools and houses and urban centers, as we'll see in a moment, designed for this site in a very particular way, which is to say a relatively infrastructure challenged geography, right? Not a lot of electrical wires, that's to say, not a lot of utilities spread throughout the island, but a lot of need for comfort to some extent, for shelter, for the provision of amenities and services, right? So Neutra started to devise this kind of principle of modernism, and we won't get into all the nuances of kind of the principles of modernism that it related to, that was less about a functionalism, right? And more about what he referred to as an operationalism, right? So how can we sort of operate as architects in such a way as to serve the common good with our interventions, with our designs? The book that these images are coming from, well, one half of this, the other one's from a journal. Here's another version. He titled, I always have to read it, An Architecture of Social Concern for Regions of Mild Climate, right? And this is in part, I think, why it's potent to the work that you're all doing, that we're sort of doing collectively in this context here in Florida, another region of mild climate, right, where I come from, Sydney, aside from the kind of hot, super hot months of the year, another region of mild climate, right? In a sense that there's a kind of capacity for architecture to intervene, to operate in slightly different ways within these spaces, so as to take advantage of that mildness, right, and to consider how to sort of adapt the building more effectively to climate. So one of the things that Neutra does here, and you'll forgive me, I'm going to jump around quite a bit, right? And some of the stuff that might not quite make sense might make more sense a little later, but it's trying to build up a kind of different sets of backgrounds to get us through to the material. But one of the things that you can see already is that he's kind of looking at the kind of, not only the angle of the roof, but this capacity for a sort of air pass-through element to allow for the ventilation to occur, even the capturing of some of the rainwater, right, through the way that the roof is designed and organized. We see again in these schools that he's designed, these kind of urban schools, the capacity for them, as we're seeing, to sort of open up onto this shared parkway, again, a kind of ventilated condition that allows the building to not require the HVAC system, right? So sort of bringing it back to that premise. So again, it's just one little first taste. We'll get a few more to kind of think about how the architecture that we have come to accustom ourselves to, that we have been conditioned to spaces such as this, and it's kind of a great exemplar space of a room that probably couldn't exist were it not adequately conditioned. There's not a lot of obvious opportunities for natural ventilation. We're in effect kind of stuck in here, right, to have this discussion, and we couldn't be here without the HVAC system as a kind of life support system, right? So in that kind of basic sense, we are breathing petroleum, right? We are kind of digesting through our lungs and often in things that we touch and things that we eat and things that we wear. But we're engaged in this kind of cycle of petroleum extraction, distribution, and sort of dissemination into fuel tanks, or I mean, maybe we're even on steam heat here actually. So I might have to change the argument a little bit. But we're reliant upon a system that comes out of a fossil fueled system in order to kind of exist in this space. And part of what I'm just going to show a few slides as I'm talking through some of this. Part of what I want us to think about is the extent to which, historically, over the period circa 1920 to circa 2020, that's a very optimistic kind of century of petroleum profligacy. And I like to say profligacy because you could do this easier pre-COVID. You kind of spit it out, when you say profligacy, right? And we've just sort of spewed oil around the world and lived off it and kind of surfed the waves, right? This century of fossil fuel profligacy, in effect, can be bracketed off, right? And we can kind of understand what was happening before fossil fuels, or at least at the beginning of it, as a means to kind of think about what happens next. Okay. I'll add one other little piece before I go on in this kind of hopefully effectively scattered preamble. Neutra's work in Puerto Rico was also really interesting because it was in relationship to a set of economic theories, right, that we would today call degrowth. But at the time were not called, and when I say that, you're supposed to go, degrowth. No, okay. at the time was referred to as a horizontal economy, right? Which is to say that why not take an island such as Puerto Rico and provide, rather than provide a kind of paternalistic relationship to the to the United States kind of mainland, provide the island with resources and utilities and materials such that it can be in effect self-sustaining, right? Allow for the economic expansion of the island to be distributed across the island rather than kind of going upwards towards mostly urban design consultants from Harvard, right? How can we sort of reimagine the relationship of that economy so that it has that kind of horizontal reach, right, rather than a vertical sort of going up, right? So it's to say that these kind of architectural interventions were also about a kind of different relationship to the costs and benefits of economic growth, right, and to understanding the relationship between economic growth and the kind of territories which it inhabited and which it often extracts from. Okay, shifting gears to a sort of part two or kind of 1.5 here, right? Again, still kind of getting us all on board and on the same page, and I'm certainly welcome questions in this, well, throughout the discussion. I want to sort of bring us up to speed, if you will, relative to this question of carbon and comfort and sort of buildings as we see them as even really just sort of, buildings as a medium to kind of draw fuels out of the soil, right? Draw fuels out from underground and sort of process them and then emit carbon into the atmosphere. Right? That's in effect what the kind of 20th century has wrought, right? Is a sort of cultural medium through which we can process fossil fuels. So I want to kind of give us, not super updated, this report is now almost exactly 2 years old, but says some important things about buildings that helps us to sort of get on board. This is a report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, I assume a body known to many here. Hopefully you haven't read the report. It's a bit annoying to read, but you kind of get the general idea. Maybe you've heard about the COP conferences, et cetera. This entire report on the mitigation of climate change, right, and the kind of two approaches to climate change are adaptation and mitigation, right? Like adjust and sort of expand the wetland so that you can manage the hurricanes, right? That's adaptation. Mitigation is sort of reduce the amount of carbon we emit so that it doesn't get worse, right? We're mitigating the problem. We're trying to make it a little bit better. So this report was in many chapters, a couple hundred pages, various forms of mitigation. We're going to focus in for a second on the buildings chapter. But it's just, I think, worth noting that the cover of the entire report was a building, right? As a kind of eco-village, a set of solar residences in Scotland. Here we see just a few other images of them that I've grabbed. You can see, this kind of expanded image that allows you to understand a little bit its thermodynamics, et cetera. A building that was really thoughtful about its relationship to fossil fuels, right? So this becomes, it's in part to suggest that buildings and design and architecture are one of the most obvious places to sort of bring some of these tools of mitigation and adaptation to bear fruit for the broader social world, right? To kind of architecture of mild climate, of social, see, I have to read the title, an architecture of social concern in regions of mild climate or otherwise. It is worth reading. Here's my notes, right, just to prove that this 1.5 pages is really dense and important. But I want to sort of extract 3 principles from this building industry chapter of the 2022 mitigation report. These 3 principles here that I'll talk through really quickly, and then we'll sort of move on to kind of apply them in a sense historically. The first is just a sort of basic premise that buildings are still reliant on carbon, right? And when you build a new building, or when you renovate a building, and you continue to specify a reliance upon fossil fuels, which often has to do with the HVAC system, right? These are the connections we're trying to draw. You're not only sort of continuing this flow of petroleum throughout the world, right? You're sort of allowing for those who are supporting the flow of fossil fuels to sort of, another kind of hatch in their belt, right? Another kind of support system for that broader regime of, again, extraction, distribution, and dissemination. So you're increasing this reliance on fossil fuels, but you're also increasing the pollution. You're also increasing the sort of labor exploitation largely occurring at the site of extraction. You're locking in this sort of destruction of the environment, right, that surrounds many of these fossil fuel fields. I'm thinking in particular of the Niger Delta, where the Niger River comes out in West Africa. That is a region that has been basically destroyed as an ecological system by virtue of fossil fuel extraction, right? So these are all the kind of effects that one is locking in by continuing to specify fossil fuels in buildings, right? So it's in part just to kind of tear my hair out collectively, maybe you can join me, right? To say, how is it that it's even legal to put up a building that requires a fossil-fueled HVAC system when we know that it's not only destroying the present, but destroying the future, right? So this is a kind of broad social question that's not just about what architects do. It's about legislation, it's about governance, it's about elections, it's about economics, it's about all sorts of things. We want to look at the kind of details of how architects can be most effectively involved. But this broad question of sort of shaking our head, banging our head against the wall in frustration that we're involved in a sort of professional operation that is damaging to the planet, right? And we're kind of struggling to find ways out of that. Okay, so that's the first, here's my lock-in building. That's the first sort of basic principle, right, which is to say that we're still, even in, I don't know, maybe you like this building, maybe you don't, the kinds of buildings that get attention in our field, positive and negative, still tend to be elaborate, carbon-hungry structures. I could have put up here the Archangel's Group's new building right next to the UN headquarters. I don't know if anybody's seen this. It's this kind of shiny glass object that kind of reaches over with this structurally steel required, heavily steel cantilever, right? I mean, kind of, again, this building here, one of the Pencil Towers of Manhattan, a sort of celebration of wasting carbon, right? I mean, it's really just a kind of how much carbon can you expend within one structure. I mean, obviously one could expend more, but it's a typology that's incredibly carbon hungry. So what is this locking in, right? It's not just locking in the kind of shell companies that own half of these apartments and the economic inequities across New York City, but the broader sort of global inequities that relate to fossil fuel distribution, and of course the kind of equity of comfort as well. Okay, second principle, sufficiency versus efficiency. Sustainable architecture, such as we've come to understand it, green architecture, and I'm running late here already, so I have to do this quickly, so you'll forgive me if I tread on anybody's toes. Green architecture, sustainable architecture, has relied on the principle of efficiency, right? We're going to provide exactly the same product. Any building that's green looks more or less exactly the same as the one next to it that was built in 1980. I mean, whatever, it's got a lot of floors. You can use it as an office space. You can use it for your hotel, right? I mean, we're providing the same service, but we're doing so with marginally less energy, right? We're making it a bit more efficient. Now, I often use this building as an example, built in the 1980s by Norman Foster as one of the early sort of green buildings, right? But that still has this massive atrium. You can see that it's really just trying to provide a similar product. It uses that atrium in different ways, and we could get into some of the details, but a similar sort of built object, just sort of doing so with a slightly different approach to energy systems and eventually to carbon emissions. I normally use this example, but I think we could also kind of look at some of these student housing, in which maybe some of you live in, kind of spread out around campus, on the edges of campus, right, that are significantly more floor space per person than one might have imagined in the 70s or 80s as somebody coming to school here, right? Not a criticism there, right? I mean, we rent what's available. It's not trying to poke at anybody. But it's to say that what the IPCC report clarifies for us is that all of the savings in efficiency that green architecture has provided, right, the marginal savings of carbon emissions based on efficient systems of solar panels, of multi-pane glass curtain wall facades, et cetera, all of those savings have been overwhelmed by just more stuff, more square meters, more square footage, sorry. We've been building more efficiently, but we've just been building more, right? So now every college individual just has a kind of implicit requirement for more space, which implies more conditioning, which might imply an extra refrigerator. I don't want to ask any questions, but kind of more energy, more systems, more space, more of everything. So this kind of basic premise that rather than playing out the question of efficiency, we might want to shift our focus to that of sufficiency, right? Which doesn't have to mean like sort of lack and sort of not enough, right? But maybe kind of just enough, right? So sufficiency, as the economist Amina Saheb, who was one of the authors of the IPCC report that I'm drawing on, sufficiency is a set of policy measures and daily practices, right, which avoid the demand for energy, right? You just don't, it's not that you're using it more efficiently and it's coming through and you still need to kind of keep the spigot on all the way. You're turning the spigot down, right? You don't need as much. Avoid the demand for energy, materials, land, water, and other natural resources while delivering well-being for all within planetary boundaries, right? It's a bit utopian, right? It's a bit of aspirational, let's say, but nonetheless worth noting. And I think the important piece for me here a set of policy measures and daily practices. And what I want to play out sort of implicitly in the next kind of 20 minutes with the rest of the material is that architecture is precisely right there, in between policy measures and daily practices. We are the sort of agents of decarbonization, that's a different talk, the agents of decarbonization that can help us to kind of understand this relationship between policy measures and daily practices and transform it most effectively, right, for living differently in the built environment. Okay, principle 1, principle 2, principle 3, upskilling. So the last thing that the IPCC Buildings Report summary says, mitigation report chapter on building summary says, is that this decade, and this was now already 2 years old, remember, this decade is the period for upskilling of the building industry, right? Meaning that what you're learning in school is, on the cutting edge of knowledge in the field, and will need to be continually sort of brought up and sort of reconditioned, if you will, retaught, rethought as the kind of professional environment is changing, professional and regulatory environment is changing around us. Which is to say that the architecture firm or the architecture school of 5, 10, 20 years from now probably doesn't look very much like it looks today, right? And that has to do with energy use, which we can kind of leave to the side for now, but that also has to do with the sort of patterns of energy consumption that we're specifying within our projects, the kind of lock-in buildings or not that we're building, right? The kind of activities that we get involved in as designers. So this question of upskilling is really just to suggest that this is the decade, right? This is the period, the time is now, right? To kind of consider as students and as pedagogues, kind of how we kind of change, reimagine the contours of the field according to this sort of transformation that we kind of know is going on, but still aren't quite sure, sort of how big it's going to be or how we kind of really get ahead of the game here, right? So, part of this is just to sort of stay aware of that flow of knowledge and that sort of transformation of professional tools and capacities, and sort of keep oneself abreast of those changes. Okay, how are we doing? Any questions or thoughts or painting something? Yeah, please.
One of the thoughts that came up in my head was looking towards
biomimicry, okay.
And kind of like these structures that can be relatively or radically different to structures we know now.
Right.
To the kind of common programs we're seeing.
Yeah, no, it's a tricky one, right? I mean, I think biomimicry, has many components to it, and I could imagine a lot of ways, let's say, sort of in general terms of kind of learning from the natural world to understand kind of modes of sufficient construction and sort of modes of habitation. I think that the kind of danger bell that goes off, right, in my mind is that biomimicry, as some of you may know, is often about a sort of structural efficiency, right, which can be great, but still the kind of efficiency is in there, right? And so I'm wondering, a lot of times this question of efficiency versus sufficiency comes up to be kind of overstated. Should we take down this building and put up a fancy, LEED 5-star tower? Or should we let the building kind of survive as it is, but adjust it and retrofit it and kind of give it some better systems and kind of make it work a bit differently, right? And the efficient 5-star tower, 5-star LEED tower, is still going to require so much embodied energy that if that's the kind of aspect, if you bring that aspect into your analysis, generally speaking, retrofit, I'm being far too schematic, right? But in that ideal kind of scenario, retrofit would win out on carbon terms, right? So I think you'd always want to be wondering, like, does this biomimetic approach, what's the difference between doing this and sort of, say, dealing with the existing building and maybe even using these same skills and tools and sort of design approaches to reimagine that building, right? So, speaking very generally, yeah. Okay, so I think we're at part 3 now. This is a kind of comparative analysis of these two buildings to help us get a sense of this kind of general premise that I put on the table of this kind of bracketed century of fossil fuel profligacy, right, of petroleum profligacy, and how by looking at kind of its early days, we can begin to imagine its kind of end times as well. Not our end times, right? It's not the end of us, it's just the end of fossil fuels, right? That's an important thing to keep in mind, right? That we're not really talking about the end of the world, right? We're talking about the beginning of a different world. We're talking about a transformation of the way that we relate to our natural environment and the Earth systems that we inhabit. People will suffer, right? millions and millions of people will suffer, but it's not an apocalyptic event in the classic sense. So, sorry, just to jump back from that, I don't know how these things come out. To look at these two buildings for a second. So the one on the left is a building designed by Pietro Beluschi, Italian-American emigre, was the head at MIT for a while, ended up in the west coast of the US in Oregon. The Equitable Insurance Tower, there are many Equitable Insurance Towers in New York as well. Insurance companies are always at the forefront of kind of more space and more stuff, right? Because they can insure it and that can sort of prove their worthiness. This is often considered the first all-glass curtain wall tower. Do you know what I mean by that, right? The entire facade is sealed. It's in effect hung from the top, sort of, or from a few places. And I'll just jump to an interior image just to explain this. There's no opening of the window, right? It's a fully sealed facade. The only way, I mean, even more extremely than in this room, the only way you can exist in this room, maybe you've had this in a hotel, maybe this is what it's like in your campus housing, I'm not sure. You need that register, right? Without this grill to bring air in and take it out, you would die, right? I mean, this building is completely dependent on its HVAC system for survival. And that was a new thing, right? It has no relationship to the climate outside. It is structured in order to completely seal itself off from the exterior climate. It could be in Portland, it could be in Bangkok, it could be in New Delhi, it could be in anywhere else, Singapore, Ghana, Accra, right? It could be in many different places. In principle, and then in practice, right? But in principle, it's completely sealed off. And you can see again in this sealed facade. I'll jump back to the comparative slide in a minute. But so what we see is again this kind of sealed condition. The building. I'm supposed to go 45 minutes, but I've been rambling a bit. 10 more minutes might be okay. Yeah. The building was that all right with you guys? Yeah. The building was built in 1947. This is where the Oppenheimer joke comes in, but I'm going to skip it because I don't have time. That's not true. This isn't really a joke. I just say that. It was built in 1947. The Boeing aircraft plant is in southern Washington state, right, just above Portland, Oregon. During the war, lots of energy was flowing from the Columbia River and from other sources into the Boeing aircraft plant to produce more stuff for the war, right, to help bomb the evil people. Once that stopped, there was what looked to be excess energy, right, and that's kind of that's where the first flag goes up, right. This was excess energy, surplus energy. And the question being, how can we use it, right? So Pietro Beluschi, the designer of this tower, and this isn't poking a finger at him. This is what architects were supposed to do at the time. The social role of architects was to kind of engage with these energy systems and conditions. Beluschi wrote, in order to continue the state of emergency that wartime has left us, right? And then from there, I'm paraphrasing, let's use as much energy as possible, right? Let's imagine a built structure that is so demanding of the energy system that we can absorb that surplus that used to be making wartime aircraft, right? And we can use that surplus within our buildings. We can keep the economy going. Energy production equals economic activity, right? We can launch the American century. We can take over the world. We can control the Middle East. We can control Venezuela. We can do it all, right? It's not all because of this building, but that's the general vibe, right? We're going to use as much energy as possible for all, not only for the energy it provides in the interior, but for all of those kind of externalities, all of those contingencies that it also brings into play. Is that making some sense? It's kind of an important point, right? It's not just the energy that goes into the room. It's what that energy does as it circulates around the world and that sort of geopolitical relationships it inspires. In any event, this building, built to continue the state of emergency. You couldn't imagine, again, inhabiting this space without the air conditioning system. Around roughly the same time, right? The Seagram's Tower, known apparently to some here. Mies van der Rohe's Seagram's Tower from 1957, the kind of template that then really was kind of spread around the world as the kind of post-war office tower, post-war modern high-rise. If you look at this building, right, there's a few interesting things to note. I mean, first of all, in 2009, there was a Green Star energy report of all the buildings in Midtown Manhattan, right, to sort of pick the lowest hanging fruit to decide which ones could receive a little bit of a retrofit and become much more energy efficient, right? So they were all ranked on a scale of 0 to 100. Does anybody know where the Seagram's Tower came in? 0 is bad, not worth saving. 100 is, all we need to do is, move a few things around and it'll be much more sustainable. 0 to 100. Go ahead. Yeah. 0 to 100. What do you think? 3. Oh my God. Nobody has ever been right before.
We went over it.
Oh, you already knew this. Oh, you knew. You're not supposed to say it if you already know. Oh, I got so excited. I got so excited. Very low, right? Like ridiculously low. So, it's not, again, it's not pointing a finger at Mies van der Rohe. It's saying that his job was to not care about energy. I mean, energy was not a factor in the production of this building. Use as much as you want. We can just get more, right? It helps us to get more. We're happy to kind of go to more countries and occupy them for their oil, right? This is kind of how we operate. And you also might notice it's a very thin curtain wall, right? Bit of an odd place for the heating registers, right? It's kind of just sort of heating the lower atmosphere of New York, right? So there's a lot of issues going on here. But it's important to note that this was the model, the style, the template that kind of went around the world. Okay, so that's one side of the equation, right? That's the kind of emergence of not only air conditioning as an idea, but its kind of necessity, right? That we can't live without it, quite literally. And again, as we are in this space. The one on the right, a building more or less the same time, 1945 in Rio de Janeiro by the firm M.E. Roberto. 3 brothers, 2 of whom had trained with Lucio Costa. We'll talk through this building for a minute. Very different sort of geopolitical circumstance, right? Not in the kind of dominant force of the United States. Brazil at the time really trying to ramp up its industrialization, right? And become a part of the global economy on different terms, very actively, very aggressively. And so the kind of production of these modern buildings was one way to both kind of symbolize, right? Kind of put on the facade like we are a modern economy. Was also a way, quite literally, to house some of the individuals that would be passing through and provide them with a bit more thermal comfort. So we see a very different sort of facade diagram here. We see a very different sectional diagram. We see a very different kind of integration of exterior and interior when we think about the sort of climatic properties of this building. You can imagine almost a kind of script, right? Almost a kind of choreography that's embedded in the section, that you kind of wake up in the morning and open this sash. The fixed vanes are always closed because of the sun at noon, right? But there's other screens that can come down or blinds that can be adjusted, right? You're kind of working with the facade to create the interior space that you're after, right, as the day goes on. There's none of this kind of turning dials, right, or pressing screens, I guess, or using our phone or watches even. There's a much more sort of physically engaged, right, kind of embodied system. I'm not going to get too much into that, right? But there's a kind of sense of your body is affected by the climate, and it's also the kind of mechanism by which you can adjust or adapt the climate, right? I'm in here in a very simple way, this kind of promotional shot, right? And it's also interesting to note that the architects would sort of take a photograph of themselves for magazines, moving this shading system around, right? This was their kind of calling card. This was how they got to be known. I just love this one. So many different ways, again, of kind of moving the shades and different sort of operating systems that can help you to kind of adjust the climate, adjust the light on different terms as the day goes on. Lots of different, kind of explosion of interest and creativity around shading systems in Brazil in the 40s and 50s. A real sort of moment where a lot of interesting things happened, right? A lot of different mechanisms were tried out, experiments were made. Most of these, we should note, were in asbestos, right? So, oops, right? But nonetheless, a lot of kind of great ideas being played out. This is probably the most well-known of the shaded modernism of Brazil in the post-war period. And again, the Ministry of Education and Health, right? This is a building that within a kind of quasi-fascist regime, a kind of authoritarian democracy, as it was called, you have a very pronounced kind of modern facade on the Ministry of Education and Health, demonstrating that the government is sort of beneficent to the population. We're here to educate you, to make you more healthy. And much of that, was true in a very complicated way. But it's nonetheless to say that this kind of premise of a shaded interior was also part of this sense of a kind of a new world, a new kind of modernity that was being entered into. Okay. So I want to shift just kind of for the last 5+ minutes. I'm going to continue this story a little bit, but we've been talking about a lot of different things. I've been trying to sort of invoke the kind of flow of oil as it kind of moves around the world and cycles through our buildings. I want us to think a little more carefully about two things for the last 10 minutes. One is the kind of question of comfort, again, sort of back more directly to the question of comfort. And the other is the kind of we that I invoked early on when I suggested that sort of we might be able to be less comfortable so that others can benefit or so that future people can benefit, and who that we is, right? And I mean, I'll get to this slide in a second, but I don't know if any of you have been following it very closely, but the geologists just decided that we are not in the Anthropocene, right? Is this on your radar? So I'm assuming the Anthropocene is a concept that's on your radar, right? The age of human transformation of the world, right? It was a complicated decision as to why they decided we are not in the Anthropocene. But the main point, at least the one I'm going to focus on, a couple of different points in there, was that it's not all of humanity. Right, the burning of fossil fuels and the transformation of the atmosphere, and the geologists are worried about the sedimentary layer, right, and how basically the carbon that we pollute into the air will eventually become sediment, and over whatever millions of years, I suppose, will be visible, right, in the strata, in some time in the future when somebody, when a rock face falls off because of erosion or whatever, you'll be able to see the layers that change, right, because of the use of carbon. But what the geologists were clear that was in fact going to happen, but it's not anthropogenic in the sense of a species condition, right? Some people are doing it and some are not, right? And we, if I can, again, be so bold as to put us in the collective of those in the global north that have been comfortable with, accustomed to using fossil fuels as if there were just plenty and we didn't have to worry about it, right? I mean, maybe slightly adjusted over the past few decades, but generally speaking, right? So it's in part to say that when we're talking about this kind of premise of comfort, right, we're talking about the sort of calculations and estimations for a very specific sort of swath of the global population, right? If you've, well, the history of air conditioning more specifically is really, begins in 1911, Yale University, where the Carrier company, which became Carrier Air Conditioners, performed a bunch of tests on 18-year-old Yale male undergrads without their shirts on, right? Sounds kind of fun. But it was very much kind of white guys, jogging in place and figuring out how they survived and how they felt and sort of asking questions and making tests afterwards. We see that a little bit here. Again, I'm not going to get too far into these kind of histories, but what we're looking at in these past two slides is the kind of moment when theories around climate and comfort began to be theorized and sort of scientificated, if you'll forgive the term, in architecture, and started to be sort of tried to enter into the design discussion a bit more directly, kind of how do you feel in your room, in your space that you're creating. And so this concept of the comfort zone, initially developed by these architects, Olgiai and Olgiai, and then sort of taken really quite aggressively by ASHRAE, by the American Society of Heating, Refrigeration, and Air Conditioning Engineers, that has set comfort standards ever since. I mean, you see this is, some dude in a suit, smoking a pipe, reading the paper, the sort of classic, I mean, if you've watched Mad Men, maybe that's too old of a reference. Is that too old of a reference, Mad Men? Okay. So that guy, right? Whatever, Draper, was that his name? Yeah. This kind of very specific individual that is rendered comfortable in this scenario according to these complex systems, right? So part of what we want to keep in mind is that this sort of premise of the we is really about, in effect, a premise of climate and carbon reparations, right? That if I'm suggesting, as I suggested at the beginning, that we all need to learn to be less comfortable, right? I'm talking about those of us who have, let's just say, the privilege to be at a university. And I don't want to make any assumptions about other aspects of your life, but I know that about you. So at least during your time that you're in school, you have access to air conditioning. You have some relationship to the kind of stable atmospheric interior condition that we're accustomed to that optimizes our labor, that allows us to be healthy, that generally speaking is pretty good air quality, et cetera, right? We have this capacity to be comfortable, and there's others that, again, might be down the street or might be around the globe that are suffering in these same conditions, right? And I mean, we can say this very explicitly. It's a bit too spread out here to maybe feel it sensibly, but we had that building in Hong Kong up a minute ago. Air conditioning doesn't actually cool the air, it just moves the heat, right? I'm sure many of you know this, right? So as you displace air outside, in most cases that waste heat, it goes up high, right, above the building. In some cases it does not. One of the legacies of the 60s and 70s modernism in Hong Kong is a lot of the waste heat goes onto the street in an already very hot and humid environment, right? So there are days when there's heat alerts that are not because of the kind of sensible heat, kind of temperature climatology, but because of the intensity of waste heat by virtue of the high running of the air conditioners, combined with the heat and humidity, et cetera. Right? So it's to say, sort of back to Neutra's notion, right, that every time we are feeling comfortable, someone is feeling less comfortable, right? And it is something of a zero-sum game, and when we sort of extract, right, our sense of, when we understand the kind of broader kind of connectivity between, again, turning on that switch of the air conditioner and the gas, the fuel that's extracted and the way that it's distributed and the pollutions from the processing systems, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So part of what I'm trying to get at is that this kind of comfort zone, again, right, becomes this intense politicized space that we as architects can intervene in, right? And politicized not explicitly or exclusively in the kind of electoral or sort of policy-oriented perspective, but politicized in the sense of our own social identities, our own aspirations and desires, right? The ways in which we see ourselves capable of moving through the world, right? We could also call it the sort of capacity for self-realization, right? Is reliant upon a certain experience of the thermal interior, right? And part of why we love comfort as a society is that it allows for that consistency. We can sleep at night, we can work during the day, right? We have that capacity to sort of operate more or less independently, if not precisely in isolation from the thermal conditions outside, so as to realize our ambitions and aspirations, right? I mean, to kind of jump over, to gloss over a few hundred years of psychology, right? So how we begin to recognize that as we are self-realizing and sort of gaining capacity, others are not, right, is really very much this sort of climate equation, right? This kind of mitigation adaptation system that we're aiming to intervene in. Okay. So I want to return then with just two really quick things to say, first of all, just to kind of end the story in Brazil on a kind of sad note, right, which is that those beautiful systems that I very quickly ran through have since been removed, right? And in this case, the kind of extended eave that was used to support these kind of shading dynamism and the kind of dance that would be instigated has been replaced as a sort of support system for chilling units, right? And because it's important to note that the shading that these the temperature differential, the kind of relative thermal comfort that these shading systems provided, is nothing compared to air conditioning, right? The power of fossil fuels trumps the capacity. Sorry, I didn't mean to say that word. Overwhelms the capacity for shading to have an impact on the interior, right? There's really no contest. And part of what's at stake is that you might often hear that, oh, we're never going to have enough renewable energy to kind of meet our current fossil fuel use, right? And that's absolutely true. We will never have enough renewable energy capacity to use the same amount of energy that we're using today by virtue of fossil fuels. So we'll both be reducing, right, the amount of increasing the amount of renewable energy available and also reducing our demand, right? This is back to the sufficiency principle. So, part of what I think these last slides help us to understand is that at stake in designing a building is what I like to think of as a set of thermal practices, right? There's the thermal practices of the architect, all of us, and our capacity to be agents of decarbonization that set up a system that might kind of integrate the user in a certain way. I'll just jump to this slide since I did the little dance bit on here. A set of interventions that allow for somebody to use the space in a specific way. So it's both the practice of design, right, and then the practice of occupation that need to get brought into account in order to understand that nexus. Practices of occupation or practices of inhabitation, as I've been calling them, that really is kind of the same thing as comfort, right? So what I want to sort of leave you with, and as a sort of potential denouement or at least an opening for questions, is how we recognize that comfort is not a kind of universal state, right? Of a sort of endless condition of kind of thermal pleasure that we want to open the door and inhabit at all times, right? But it's rather a set of practices, a set of interactions, a set of sort of ways of being within a space that we can change, that we can alter, that we can disrupt, that we can reimagine as we move forward. I think I'll stop there. I've got other things here, but yeah, please, go ahead.
How, as an architect or a designer, can you create this kind of uncomfortable
Right. Well, kind of any means necessary, right? I think there's kind of two answers, right? I mean, one is make sure the person using the space knows that they're using less carbon, have a little thing on the wall, or their watch beeps or whatever, make it like really almost a performance of using less carbon, right? Because that sort of trains us to be excited by that, right? The other version is, completely hide it. Like, maybe you won't know the difference, right? If we, and I think but I think the bigger picture there, architects, if you think about, what's a building that you kind of know and love in recent architectural history? I'm putting you on the spot. Yeah, perfect. Okay. So he's referring to the Nakagan Capsule Tower, very recently taken down, unfortunately. That's a building. If you think about that building, there's a lot of discomfort embedded in there, right? And if you think about most sort of buildings that we kind of celebrate, there's something, we might call it novelty. We might call it formal exploration, right? We might call it parametric wonder, right, or whatever. But there's some kind of sense of like, oh, this is a little different, right? But part of the architect's job is to say, yeah, it's different, but it's cool. If I can be a little oversimplistic about the social project of architecture, right? Yes, it's different, but it's better, right? That's the kind of principle of modernism. We could kind of go through a bunch of things like that. So it's part to say that architects have long been producing spaces that people might initially react to, with some discomfort, right? But doing so in such a way that there's a kind of, it's not necessarily a reward, but it sort of becomes interesting enough that you overlook it, or you accept it, or you kind of run with it, right? So it's in part to say we've been doing this for decades, right? Just not relative to HVAC, right? We've kind of kept HVAC hidden, and that's been more about formal exploration or the sit stair, or now there's, the sit stair is maybe come and gone, but the first one, it's like, do I sit? Do I walk? There's this kind of discomfort with use and value and sort of what I'm supposed to do in this space, right? So I think we want to recognize that our capacity to intervene in the way that people live in spaces is one of the kind of valuable things that we bring to this discussion, right? Yeah. Yeah.
When you're talking about the process of lower demand, where the future is going to be lowering demand and increasing that renewable energy, what's kind of like the working process is? I can imagine if you work to lower demand first, we would still have that excess, right? And you're talking in the past, the use of excess, just using it up in any other way. Right.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question, right? Can you imagine an energy surplus that just somebody lets sit there? Who lets them sit, who protects it, basically, is the question. We do have strategic oil reserves. They're protected in some way. I think it's a really interesting question, how we really, on the one hand, it's to say there's so many contradictions, right? Like, electric cars are more efficient in operation, back to this kind of embodied and operational question, right? Generally more efficient in operation, generally not in embodied energy, right? Especially when you take in the kind of lithium batteries and their replacement kind of into account and the weight, et cetera. So it's to say a lot of solutions appear to be solutions, but then quickly, kind of dissipate. How, the question, both of these questions in a sense are sort of, how do we convince people to feel comfortable with less, right? And the kind of stark version of that is either we figure it out as architects, or it happens anyway, right? It's either by design or by default that we start to sort of manage our energy metabolism in different ways, because eventually it's just going to get to the point where we have no choice, either because breakdown of distribution systems and the fuel isn't available, or because of benevolent government agents that stop the kind of extraction and dissemination of fuel, right? So might as well get ahead of the game, right? So the question of sort of how do we kind of think about design methods that help us to encourage others to reimagine their aspirations for their lives inside, right? Which I say because we tend to think like, if I'm hot, or especially if I'm cold inside, why don't I just turn up the heat? Like, maybe it's because I can't afford to, or maybe it looks like I can't afford to, or there's all these kind of social dynamics and equity dynamics around being uncomfortable on thermal terms, right? And there's rapid differences in gender, in ethnicity, in sort of background relative to when and how you feel comfortable, right? We've just sort of mapped these all as this kind of universal condition, vis-a-vis ASHRAE and other forms of regulations. But one strategy is to sort of amplify people's differences, right? And kind of understand, a lot of people, I hate saying things like a lot of people, right? Because it's far too general. But one can sort of schematize a scenario by which we can allow, certain people are allowed to be comfortable already, right? I made the joke about the shirtless 18-year-olds at Yale. It's not a joke, it really happened. That's, if you go into your standard office building and your standard downtown, those people are comfortable. Women tend to prefer slightly colder environments. There's a whole kind of set of issues around who gets the outside office and the inside office. It's also gendered, that it has to do with sick building syndrome and other sorts of toxicities that are also circulating in these systems, right? So I'm just sort of trying to ramble on to play out the complexities a little bit, right? That part of our challenge as designers, I think, is that we've had a sort of model of operation in this kind of sustainable space that's about solutions, right? That we're going to take the brief, we're going to, solve the problem, we're going to provide the solar panels or the multi-paned glass curtain walls. Those are my only two examples. I'll just use them over and over as means to kind of solve this problem and make it go away. And that's part of this kind of permission structure of sustainability, right? So I'm trying to kind of push back a little bit around the notion that we have obvious solutions, which was not your question. I'm unfairly taking advantage of your question to make another point, which is that really it's about experiments, right? And how we kind of see in this kind of dynamic between what we design and how spaces are occupied, a new kind of realm for experimentation, right? Of how we want to live in the future, right? So for example, I could imagine, that a studio could decide that they're going to prop open the door to, especially on the third floor where we were today, prop open the door with the key-coded entry on it, which you probably don't want to do, it's probably not allowed, and prop open the balcony door and turn off your air conditioning system. Because it's pretty nice out, right? And that allows the air to move through the space, and as long as you're not using too many foam cutters, I saw a few foam cutters, right? You have that capacity to sort of shift your experience of the space, right? And is that desirable? Or sort of how can that be designed in such a way so as to be made desirable? If you then just imagine a more kind of open plan. Yeah?
I have a question about just living in home is something that is not considered a luxury in the United States anymore. In fact, it's not just for granted, but just assumed that that's what we must have. And how much does your research, but that was an idea that was sold to us, and that wasn't always the case, and that's certainly not the case in other parts of the world. How much do you look at different housing models that have a much smaller footprint per person?
Yeah, great question. So it's another, sorry, I'm going to give you another really kind of unfair answer. Because, part of the talk of, to think about a sufficient floor plan, right? And we have a lot of models, again, not only kind of back to the Germans and kind of minimum existence dwelling, Carl Teague in the mid-20s. There's a whole world of sort of optimizing floor plans in the French suburban expansion in the 50s and 60s that are just these beautiful floor plans that can fit a lot of people comfortably, again, this word, into a relatively compact amount of space. It seems, however, you might also know these were the sites of riots and unrest, and so not to say that's because of the buildings at all, right? But there's often been a dynamic to sufficient living that has been quite radically inequitable, right? So it's not just that you have a small space to live, but the maintenance is lax, and the services that surround you are inadequate, right? So there's sufficiency has tended to go along with all of the kind of terrors of inequity, right? And so on the one hand, the kind of American model seems to offer a suburban condition in which potentially some of those issues are excised, right? Insofar as assuming accessibility to a car. And again, there's a lot of work that's looked directly at that, and I have an article came out last year in Art Papers that's looking at kind of sufficient houses in the immediate post-war period in the US. I thought I had some slides. My hand kind of twitched towards the keyboard, but I don't think I have them here. But it's not only a kind of small square footage, right? It's also kind of a house that can grow or shrink, right? If you have children and then they leave, or your elderly parents come back, right? It's a different, again, sort of approach to the construction process that allows for the building to be flexible. We all know that buildings are often renovated and expanded, right, but not in ways that are necessarily especially carbon efficient, right? I mean, but I'm dancing around it a little bit because I think there's a lot of potential models for sufficiency. It's hard to imagine a suburban model as being the best way there, right? And so, I mean, urban density becomes beneficial in many ways relative to this question of reducing demand on resources. I mean, there's other alternatives there, but you know, especially if we're driving to those suburban houses, right? That sort of complicates the sufficiency equation. Advocating for density tends to be a good strategy, right? And I think, you know, I guess I like to see kind of places. I mean, I grew up in Colorado in the, you know, long stretched suburbs in the Mountain West. I tend to see places such as that and such as here, if I may, right, as just kind of amazing opportunities for densification, right? Like it's just this endless field of opportunities for densification. Although already you're talking about a lot of embodied energy, right? And you're talking about, are you building new buildings? Are you, you know, if you're concentrating individuals within spaces, you know, how are you sort of rationalizing that or managing that on material terms? Everybody's working from home, let's reuse downtowns, you know, that's one of the pictures here too. I think, again, it's kind of any means necessary, but I think it's, part of what I'm trying to model here is I kind of go back and forth between thinking I've answered your question and then not answering it, is that these are kind of subjects for debate, right? These are subjects for contention, these are political issues that we need to hash out with our peers, with our colleagues, with our professors, with our kids and friends, and et cetera, with our legislators, with our community boards. How do we think, you know, what is the kind of path forward for Gainesville or Central Florida relative to, you know, some of these questions around sufficiency and efficiency? It's going to be very different than it is in Sydney or LA or, you know, other places. Yeah, and there's never kind of like, thing, we've got it figured out. And it's really, anytime you think that, like, take a few steps back, kind of think about it again, make sure you really found the kind of ultimate solution, because it's usually not, right? And one of the sort of terrors of our present environment is that, you know, there will be winners and losers, right? And on the one hand, you probably want to be with the winners, right? But it's like, how can you be with the winners in such a way so as to make it so there's as few losers as possible? Is kind of the challenge that we face as people and as architects, right? And because, you know, precisely this contradiction, if that's what it is, between embodied energy and carbon emissions on the one hand and a desperate housing crisis on the other is, you know, the sort of crystallization of so much of what we're struggling with as a society right now. I hedge a little bit because I think we have a lot of, again, square footage of housing is just, it's occupied by individuals and single families rather than, you know, many of these McMansions that, I mean, have the kind of capacity, if you will, for many more inhabitants. But then I start sounding like a Soviet planner in the 1920s, which could get me in trouble. Other thoughts, questions? Oh, why? We've gone on, yeah. Oh, yeah, please.
Follow-up question. First of all, thank you so much for this. And about this concept of sufficiency versus efficiency, I understand the merit of the concept. However, efficiency is measurable.
Yeah.
It's very objective.
Yeah.
Sufficiency is rather subjective.
Yeah.
So what is sufficient?
Yeah.
When you call it sufficient. So that opens the door to some kind of interpretations that may not be what we intended in the first place and might not achieve what we are hoping.
Yeah. No, precisely. And I mean, I think implicit in what you're saying is that it can be used by authoritarian means, right? I just was about to go into a whole Soviet planning thing, right? That was precisely taking over people's houses and bringing the proletariat in, right? It wasn't pretty. It didn't work out well for anybody. So I'm gonna again answer it a little sideways, just if I can, which is that I think there's a really interesting discussion in these circles right now around the question of urgency, right? Which is to say, you know, we're desperate to make transformational adjustments to the way that we live and occupy space and travel around and be in buildings, et cetera. You know, we all know, some of us maybe a bit more than others, that, you know, the kind of the reality of carbon emissions and what that is kind of bringing about around the world. But a lot of the, you know, those of us educated in the humanities, when we hear emergency or state of emergency or urgency, we quote Walter Benjamin, who said very clearly and coherently in 1943, as he was running from the Nazis, right, that the state of emergency will always, I'm not quoting him actually, I'm paraphrasing because I don't have it in my notes. Do you have it? No? State of emergency, some people do, right? It's one of those things. The state of emergency is basically almost always an excuse for tyranny, right? It's always an opportunity for more oppression, right? And not that that opportunity is always taken, but often enough, right? So if you're talking about urgency, if you're kind of, you're often bulldozing people's lives, right? You're often dramatically transforming people's lives without their permission so that you can put this thing together really fast, right? It's the kind of Google version, right? Run fast and break things, or what is it, right? It's this kind of arrogance of the inevitability of one's technological solution. Taken, understood, right? That urgency produces crises, damages people's lives, right? But I think what we're facing, and I'm obviously modeling this on the sufficiency, efficiency bit, right? What we're facing is that if we don't take these urgent actions, still people will suffer, right? That for different reasons, different people, different dynamics, a different sort of political approach, right? But nonetheless, suffering will ensue, right? And I see the kind of sufficiency, efficiency thing in the same way. That I'm not trying to suggest that throw out your solar panels and efficiency is kind of for the birds, right? I'm saying it's insufficient in effect, right? I mean that efficiency is a great model. We have a huge amount of technical knowledge in our field that is focused on efficiency, performance for decades, right? And there's I don't mean to suggest in any way that we sort of get rid of that, right? But we recognize that it needs to be accompanied by some form of sufficiency measure, right? And recognize the danger therein, right? I mean, I think that, recognize that those sufficiency measures are probably most likely going to be used for evil, right? I mean, and unless we kind of build up bulwarks and kind of be really careful about how we negotiate that, right? That's the kind of default, if you will. I mean, to overstate it a little bit, right? So this becomes, again, a sort of activist advocacy sort of political set of discussions that says, we want to encourage sufficiency, but we don't want to do so in a way that, we want to minimize the taking away of rights in the process, right? We want to do so in a way that, and a lot of the people that study this stuff suggest, and this is a frequent sort of framework, right, that it'll happen when it has to. That we'll kind of live in smaller quarters and in closer context and in a different sort of community when we're forced to, right, rather than when we kind of select to, right, and kind of opt to. And so part of that sufficiency side of the equation starts to be about enacting sort of desires that have kind of these future people in mind, right, perhaps even more than the contemporary people, which is a difficult externality to kind of bring into our decision-making process. How'd that go? Yeah? Okay, I got a 1 thumbs up. That's all I need. It'll get me through dinner.
I did want to say, too, I've been checking on my phone to see if we have any questions.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Orlando or Jacksonville, none.
Oh, okay.
I did want to also say that today's the first time that we simulcast to Miami-Dade College in Miami, epicenter of the climate crisis
yes,
in
indeed.
America.
Yeah.
Vis-a-vis sea level rise. And no questions there, but a lot of appreciation
Great,
for
appreciate
the
it. Yeah, good stuff. Yeah.
Well,
Thanks
thank
for
you
your
again,
attention.
Daniel
Yeah,
Barber,
pleasure.
for joining us. And thank you all.